Thank you all for coming. If I could ask you for something to start, would you all just kind of come a little closer? Just come a little closer. You know, I'll be like all, yeah, you too, come on. Sit next to me. Yeah. Hold me. Just hold me through this. Yeah, see, come on, thank you. Okay, now you're really close. This is that's a little bit awkward. Yeah, a bit back up one more row. Not really. Yeah. So thank you all for coming. Thank you all for being here this morning. I want to start this talk by introducing you to someone very special. And not literally, she's not actually here. But there's a woman I know that I want to tell you a little bit about. Her name is Lauren, and I met her at the farmer's market in Biloxi, Mississippi, which, if you have never had the pleasure of being the farmer's market in Biloxi, Mississippi, is in fact like a few square yards of blacktop underneath a highway overpass, where like a dude will drive up in a pickup truck with his back like full of like collard greens like falling out the back, and there's like another dude who shows up in another pickup truck and with like a hand-painted sign that totally looks like it comes out of a cartoon. It's like some of the letters are like backwards, and it says like hot boiled peanuts, and he's got this big pot of boiled peanuts that are like still hot, and given the size of the pot, you know it's gonna be hot for like 3 more days, and it's probably like a bacteria farm. And you know, so it's this kind of a market, right? And in between all these people, Lauren is this like middle-aged Caribbean lady, and she has this rickety little table, and she just kind of hangs out in a folding chair and sits next to her table, and she sells a few things from her garden. She has a few like Caribbean products, and she also has some like random vegetables that I'm not really sure where she comes by them. They're just kind of there. And I actually remember she's awesome, and she's super salty. And once I was talking with her at her table, and this very proper Southern lady comes up and says, "Where are these green beans from?" And Lauren just looks at her and goes, "A box." So anyway, the first time, that was a joke. You can laugh, please. It was true, but it was meant for humorous effect. Anyway, the first time I started talking with her, she, like maybe like 10 minutes into our conversation, she started telling me about this time that she had a fight with her husband that ended right around the time she reached behind the couch and pulled out a sword. And afterwards she said she went to see a lawyer because, quote, "now we had problems." And so you can probably tell Lauren is the kind of lady who doesn't take any shit. And I realized that even before she told me about the sword, because I asked her how a lady from Barbados ends up in Biloxi. And she gave me the most glorious side eye. I was like, and she said, "I didn't end up in Biloxi. You end up somewhere when you try to go somewhere else and find you are not appreciated there. I came to Biloxi." Then later, still at her table, I picked up a taro root, and she calls them edos. And she told me about how she used to hate them. She hated them when she was a little girl because she ate one raw, and she's like, she like pawed at her throat. She's like, "I felt like I had nettles in my throat." She always avoided them. She's like, they were just like, you know, they were like the devil's food. But then one day, like many years later, she was 6 months pregnant, and she walked home from work. She had like one of these, like I walk barefoot, you know, 6 miles to and from work, and she tripped on a root, and she fell, and she lost her baby, and she described it in the most awful detail. And the doctor told her she had to eat Edo soup to get better. So she had to learn to love eating Edos. And I learned all this because the first time I got to her table, the first time I saw her, I asked her about the sorrel on her table. And I asked her at some point about her okra, and I began to learn about the rest of her life, the entirety of her life, 10 minutes at a time. And I bring Lauren up because I have this theory. And the theory goes like this. If you can talk about food and you can talk about football, you can talk with 75% of people in America. And talking to people is important. To me, as a writer, the stories I love writing the most are the stories that I first hear, right? That I first hear from talking that people entrust me with. And so talking to people is my work and it's my passion, but it's, frankly, it's not always easy. When I was younger and I was about to go to a new school, my cousin, who was like taller and like better looking and a better dancer and more popular than me, said to me, in your school, girls aren't going to really want to talk to you because you're Chinese. And so he tried to help me out he tried to help me out. I swear to God this happened. He came over to my house. I grew up in New Jersey. He comes over to my house and he starts to show me how to walk. He's like, you got to walk like this. He started to show me Jersey swagger. And I swear to God, 2 days, I was like, Mom wasn't looking. I'd be in the bathroom being like, I swear to God, I was trying to throw Jersey swagger into my walk. It was amazing. And it didn't work. So my walk game was weak and girls did not talk to me. But at the end of the day, I did not actually think it was because I couldn't walk like, someone from Jersey Shore. But it was because I would feel weird talking to people sometimes. And maybe it's because I'm Chinese and that makes me a little bit different. And I remember very distinctly, when sometimes I'd stay after school and I might have to call my grandfather to come pick me up, and his English was sort of shaky, so I always had to speak with him in Chinese. And I remember I'd go down the hall and make a left and go down this other hall into these little area of lockers where there was one hidden payphone. And I would go there, make sure no one was around, and I would call him and ask him to come pick me up because I didn't want anyone to hear me talking in Chinese. And I got over those hang-ups eventually, and I guess I did it with a vengeance because I became a writer who's really just a talker who happens to have a notebook. But whatever talking to people has ever meant on the surface, whether it means getting phone numbers or going on dates or getting interviews for stories, I've always thought that it means something else underneath, and it means that you belong. And so talking to people about food, I think, is a great way to establish that you belong, right? Because food is so personal, and it's so much about memory and family and what you were raised with and what matters to you. It's this really pointed way to get to know people. But it's also broad enough, to let strangers into conversation, as I showed with Lauren. But for all those same reasons, right, it's a powerful way to talk about culture. And not in this academic way where you're way up in the tower, but in details that matter on the ground, details that matter in people's lives. And so here's something I say a lot. I eat food because I love food, and I cook food because I love food, but I write about food because I love people. Because talking about food is almost always really talking about people. And that gets a little lost sometimes. It's funny, I think, I noticed the title of this talk was sort of misprinted in the program as Why I Talk About American Food, when the title that I thought originally is Why I Talk to Americans About Food. And it's funny, it's this sort of thing where sometimes you hear something and your brain just kind of automatically transposes the words into what you think it should have been. And so What I Talk About American Food makes sense as a title. But for me, it kind of also shows that in this weird world we kind of live in, this sort of foodie culture world where people collect restaurant meals like trading cards, and they take pictures of every course and they tweet them and they scroll for the right Instagram filter while the food gets cold. They ignore the actual people sitting at the table with them, and while they're shooting their sticky food porn out into the virtual world. And sometimes we get a little caught up in the food as an object all to itself. And we all know people who get a little carried away like that, and I'm sure many of us secretly hate those people. But sometimes I also have to remind myself to think of it this way, and those people might be acting a little antisocially at the table, or they may be missing the point or whatever, but really they're still trying to communicate something, right? They're still trying to have a conversation. It may be a weird, sort of distant, handheld conversation, but it's a conversation to them all the same. And so however we do it, talking about food is really about the act of talking with people. It's about, again, the feeling of belonging with people. And here we are at a food event, and I recognize that, I'm preaching a little bit to the choir, and, because food people are always saying about how, oh, food is really all about coming together. As chefs, you spend your lives working with food, but so many chefs you talk to, it's like, oh, at the end of the day, it's really about making people happy. It's about bring people together. And I really appreciate that, and I'm sure we all appreciate that sentiment, that notion. And for a lot of us, I'm sure it drives what we do, it drives who we are. But I also kind of feel like what we don't hear enough about, maybe as food people, is how it's not all like sweetness and light, right? Our relationships with food are as complicated as our relationships with ourselves, and they're as complicated as our relationships with other people, which is to say they're really fucking complicated. And one day, somewhere like around 9 or 10 years old, I was at my parents' Chinatown shop. And I was reheating some pork and pickles in the microwave for a snack. They were leftovers. They were delicious. They were leftovers I took home from lunch that I had with my dad. And I remember he was so psyched to take me to this new place that he was really excited about in the neighborhood. I remember sitting down with him. It was kind of weird. It was one of those moments you were a kid, but all of a sudden you realize, wow, I don't really sit down just with Dad so much. So I had this it was just a little moment. We just had some pork chops and pickles. And so they were we were back at the shop. It was in the afternoon. My parents were, doing something else. So I was the only one sitting there in the office, and this very important client came in. And I could tell he was important because he was tall and well dressed. And he had a British accent. He was a white dude with a British accent. And I don't know if I'd ever actually met a British person yet at that point in my life. So he was talking, and I thought he was the king of Britannia, right? This guy's coming in. And he said, the first thing he said when he walked in was, "What in God's name is that awful smell?" And I looked down at my plate, and I pretended to be disgusted by it. And I said, I don't know what that is, and I threw it out. And that's how I learned a lesson about shame. And I remember now, decades later, I still remember it so clearly, and it makes me realize that anything as powerful as food can do just as much harm as it can good, right? Power is not value neutral. Or power is value neutral, rather. Something powerful is just powerful. And it's never only powerful for good, right? It can hurt just as much as it makes you feel great. And so all this brings me to a conversation I had a couple years ago now with someone named Eddie Huang. And some of you may know him or know of him. He has this place called Bauhaus in New York, where he mostly serves Taiwanese food he grew up with. And we talked for a long time once about what it means when people cook food that belongs to someone else's heritage, right? About what it means to cook someone else's cuisine and respect it or not respect it. And we ended up actually with a disagreement on what it means to call something American. And I said to him that, I think of America, I have this really broad definition of American, right? And it's one that includes and celebrates the contributions of our immigrants. And Eddie had a different perspective, and he once wrote, quote, "America is a processing plant that imports materials and people from all around the globe, chews them up, spits out something that bears the blood, sweat, and tears of something foreign, but is claimed and branded American. It's not fair. America is just a place that sells you on a lie and takes advantage of the weak." And our disagreement came down basically to the fact that I think of America first really as an idea. Right? I think of it first as a noble concept. It's about liberty and freedom and the American dream, which, right, is about people coming here to work hard and aim high. And if that's what makes America great, if that American dream is what makes America great, then really what we're saying is the strength of our country is the strength in our diversity, and it drives us to keep reinventing ourselves, right? So I want to look at like who we're trying to be and not settle for, you know, how we may fall short of our ideals, right? And a little while later, Eddie wrote on his blog, he wrote, well, as much as I love Francis, his ideas about aspiring to join America leads to the loss of your culture. You have to defend your culture. And he used the word assimilation to describe what I'm talking about. And I really thought about that a lot. Because I learned a lesson in assimilation the day I threw out my lunch. Right? I wanted to get rid of the food that this big, important man thought was disgusting because I wanted to wash myself of my ethnicity. Right? I didn't want to be weird. I didn't want to have stinky food that this, you know, important British. By the way, he's British. Like, he comes from somewhere else too, right? But in my mind, it was just like, no, you're different, not him. You need to fit in. And I threw out the lunch that my dad shared with me because I wanted this stranger to accept me. And years later in the 7th grade, I remember learning another lesson about assimilation when I actually heard that word for the first time. Assimilation is what the melting pot is all about, my teacher said, and people coming to America from all over the world, shedding their old culture and taking on American culture. It's something they find here and they, you know, put it on like new clothing, like a new skin. And it's about giving up to blend in. And this is what Eddie is talking about, right? When he says you lose everything you lose everything you came with in exchange for false approval. And it's not just me. I know it's not just me, because I also think about my friend's Italian immigrant grandfather, who his whole life refused to eat garlic because he was terrified it would make him smell too ethnic, right? And now you think that's absurd. It is absurd that someone would think, oh, eating garlic makes you too ethnic, but that's what he felt, right? And it wasn't that long ago. Then my teacher said something I've never forgotten. Well, the mixing pot is how we used to think of it. Now we think of America more like a mixed salad, where all the ingredients are different, but they add up to a whole. And it was both the goofiest, but like the most important analogy I'd ever heard, right? It took me years to really learn that lesson, to be honest, like really learn it into my bones, because remember, like that was in 7th grade, and like into high school, I was still like hiding and calling my grandfather from the lockers where like no one could hear me, but it's the foundation now of what it means to me to be an American, right? For me, to be an American means that I am a part of your salad. And you, Bobby, are a part of my salad. And I know how that sounds, but it's going to be okay. But you know what I'm talking about. He loves salads. So I don't really understand what it means for me to be, you know, quote, defending my culture if that culture is supposed to be Chinese. Because I grew up in a seriously immigrant household, and we ate, you know, Chinese food every night in that there was a bowl of rice at every setting, and we had chopsticks, and we spun food around on this like aspirational Lazy Susan that was made of like the crappiest plastic until like we could afford to buy a nice Lucite one. And, like, wow, we're really coming up in the world. We have like a Lucite Lazy Susan. But we'd be spinning around, you know, green stir fry with ginger and garlic, which are traditional, and we'd be stewing around beef stew with tomatoes, which are pretty traditional, but, you know, obviously, as we all know, tomatoes come from the New World anyway. And we would sometimes spin around, like if it was on special at ShopRite, sautéed steak, which, as you can imagine, is not traditional, right? But we ate soy sauce chicken from Chinatown, and we ate fried chicken from Roy Rogers. And so what I'm saying is, Roy Rogers is a part of my culture. Supermarket steak is a part of my culture. And for the same reasons, that means stir frying is a part of your culture, right? Eating a bowl of rice with chopsticks is a part of your culture. Whether you do these things or not, whether you do them, quote, you know, the right way or not, whether you even understand them or not, they're just a part of American culture. because I'm an American. And I'm not talking about trying to join America, it's just that I'm an American. It's just that my parents, who have been here for 40 years and still talk with an accent, are American. It just is what it is. And we're a part of this culture in the exact same way that all of us are a part of our culture. And so now I actually like to talk in the language that my parents grew up with, even when I'm in public. And I actually feel more than anything shame that I spent those years trying to avoid it, because my father was actually visiting me at home the last week, and I remember trying to talk, and just like words were coming out slowly, and I didn't really have the language like I wanted to anymore, just because I'm so rusty with it. And now I think, God, if I had like really tried to speak it as well as I could when I was a kid and really kept it up over the years, I would be more fluent than I am now. And that's what fills me with shame, that I haven't held on to that part and haven't shown that part to the world more. I don't throw away my food anymore if you think it smells weird. I might offer you some, and I'll talk to you about it. And I'll talk with you about what it is that you're eating. And I'll talk with you about what language your parents grew up with. And I'm a pretty good talker. I can crack some jokes, and I can listen, I can pay attention. I'll ask you questions. And maybe we'll have a good time talking, and maybe we won't, because it's not always easy. But Eddie talks about how you have to take your culture, how you have to make your own America. Well, this is how I take it. And this is how I put my stake in the ground. I talk with you. And when we're talking, we belong together. Thank you.